6 weeks after her father's funeral, Alicia received $340,000 from his estate, the accumulated savings of a man who had worked in a hardware store for 37 years and lived modestly the entire time. Within 14 months, she had spent almost all of it, a down payment on a house she couldn't otherwise afford, a lavish extended trip she described at the time as something her father would have wanted her to enjoy, and a series of loans to family members she never expected repaid. Her brother Daniel received an identical $340,000 from the same estate, and 18 months later, still hadn't touched a dollar of it. Unable to make a single decision about the money, the funds simply sitting untouched in a basic checking account, earning almost nothing, frozen by a discomfort he couldn't fully explain even to himself. Financial advisors and grief counselors who specialize in what's sometimes called sudden money syndrome describe both of Alicia and Daniel's reactions as strikingly common responses to inherited wealth, specifically, distinct in important ways from how people typically handle money earned or saved gradually. Estate planning research has found that a significant share of inherited wealth is depleted within a relatively short window, not primarily because heirs lack financial intelligence, but because inherited money arrives entangled with grief, guilt, and family dynamics in ways that fundamentally change how a person relates to that specific pool of money compared to money they built themselves. The mechanism behind Alicia's rapid spending traces back to something grief counselors describe frequently in clients navigating a parent's estate: an unconscious discomfort with the idea of personally benefiting from a parent's death, a feeling that spending the money quickly, especially in ways framed as honoring the parent or living the way they would have wanted, resolves an emotional tension the money itself created. Alicia genuinely believed, in the moment, that each purchase reflected her father's values and would have made him proud. Looking back later, in therapy, she recognized the pattern differently: money that felt too uncomfortable to simply keep and grow, precisely because keeping it required sitting with the reality of how she'd come to have it, got converted, as quickly as possible, into experiences and gifts that let her stop holding that discomfort. Daniel's paralysis, on the surface, looks like the opposite response, but grief counselors trace it back to a closely related root, where Alicia resolved the discomfort of inherited money through rapid spending. Daniel resolved it, unconsciously, through avoidance, treating the entire sum as something he wasn't yet ready to actively engage with in any direction, spending or investing, because any decision felt like it required a kind of closure with his father's death that he wasn't emotionally prepared to reach. The money sitting untouched wasn't financial prudence in Daniel's case, despite superficially resembling it. It was a form of postponement, a way of keeping the entire question, and everything it represented about his father's absence, at arm's length indefinitely. This entanglement between grief and financial decision-making is precisely why financial advisors who specialize in estate settlements consistently recommend a specific, counterintuitive piece of guidance: avoiding major financial decisions, buying property, quitting a job, large gifts to family, for at least 6 to 12 months following a significant inheritance, not because the money requires that much time to invest wisely in any technical sense, but because grief itself distorts judgment in ways that are difficult to recognize while they're happening, and decisions made during that distortion frequently don't reflect what the person would actually choose once the acute grief has eased. There's also a family dynamic that complicates inheritance decisions specifically, one that rarely gets discussed openly until it's already causing damage. Alicia describes feeling significant, largely unspoken pressure from extended family members who knew about the inheritance, several of whom approached her for loans within months of the funeral, framing requests in terms of what her father would have wanted, a framing Alicia found almost impossible to push back against while still actively grieving him. Estate attorneys and family therapists who work with inheriting families describe this pattern as extremely common. Extended family, and even close friends treating a recent inheritance as an implicit shared resource, applying emotional pressure that's considerably harder to resist in the months immediately following a parent's death than it would be at almost any other point in a person's financial life. None of this means there's a single correct way to handle an inheritance, and financial advisors are generally clear that grief itself doesn't disqualify someone from making thoughtful decisions. Nor does spending some of an inheritance on meaningful experiences or family generosity represent a mistake in every case. The distinction that matters isn't whether money gets spent or saved, but whether the decision was made deliberately, after some genuine space from the acute grief, rather than as an unconscious attempt to resolve the discomfort the money itself represents, whatever direction that resolution happens to take. The practical guidance that grief counselors and financial advisors converge on tends to be simple, even if it's difficult to follow in the moment. Separate the grief processing from the financial processing as much as possible, ideally working with two different professionals rather than treating financial advice as sufficient to handle what is, underneath the numbers, a genuinely emotional decision. Placing inherited funds into a simple, low-risk holding account for the first several months, deliberately avoiding either rapid spending or complete avoidance, buys time specifically for the kind of clearer thinking that grief, in its most acute early phase, makes very difficult to access. Alicia and Daniel, several years later, have both arrived at versions of the money conversation neither could access in those first 18 months. Alicia, after working through the guilt specifically in grief therapy rather than only in financial counseling, has rebuilt a modest but stable savings position and describes far more clarity now about which of her earlier purchases genuinely reflected her father's values and which had simply been an attempt to stop feeling uncomfortable holding his money. Daniel, after nearly 2 years of paralysis, finally moved his portion into a diversified investment account, a decision he describes not as finally reaching a financial conclusion, but as finally reaching enough distance from his father's death to let the money simply become money again, rather than a question he wasn't yet able to answer. Both siblings ultimately learned that inherited money carries more than financial value. The challenge is not only deciding what to do with the money, but understanding what the money represents.